Andrea Evans spent her childhood in an orphanage after her parents perished in a bombing during the war that destroyed their house. She remained in the orphanage for the rest of her life until it was time for her to graduate. Upon graduating, Andrea was offered a house in the countryside. She eagerly accepted the offer, as she had always dreamed of having a place of her own. Despite her desire to further her education, she had no means to do so. The orphanage had arranged for her to attend a local technical school, but she declined the opportunity. As she approached the house, Andrea heard a greeting from someone nearby. Turning her head, she saw a woman standing outside. "Good morning," Andrea cheerfully replied to the woman's greeting. The woman then asked, "Are you visiting us?" Without hesitation, Andrea opened the gate and stepped into the fenced area. While the house was not brand new, Andrea noted that it was well maintained and tidy. As she stepped inside, she realized that this was the start of her adult life. "Feel free to let me know if you need anything," the neighbor offered before leaving the house. Left to her own devices, Andrea wasted no time in getting to work. She began cleaning the house and washing the windows, determined to make her new place as comfortable and beautiful as possible. She worked tirelessly, taking care of every detail to ensure that her home was a place she could truly call her own. Andrea called out to her neighbor, Mrs. Austin, from the street outside of her house. "Mrs. Austin," she shouted, prompting the woman to look out the window. "I baked a pie. Would you like to get to know each other over a slice?" Andrea suggested. Mrs. Austin was delighted to have company and invited Andrea inside, offering her some liquor to drink alongside the pie. As they sat in the kitchen and chatted, Andrea asked about the village. Mrs. Austin sadly replied, "There is nothing much to tell. There are hardly any men left, and the young people have all moved away, but we manage to live and work here." Andrea tried to stay optimistic and said, "That's okay. Things will get better." Mrs. Austin then mentioned that the local post office was in need of a letter carrier and asked if Andrea would be interested in the job. "Of course, I won't refuse any job if it's possible," Andrea agreed immediately. The following day, Andrea accompanied Mrs. Austin to the local post office, where they confirmed the urgent need for a letter carrier. Andrea was offered the job, which she happily accepted. She enjoyed her daily routine of delivering letters, witnessing the joy on people's faces as they received their mail. Despite the newfound sense of fulfillment in her life, Andrea still yearned for a larger family. She longed for a husband and, above all, a child of her own. While her memories of living with her parents were hazy, she still vividly recalled the feeling of her mother dressing her up in a beautiful dress and taking her outside. Andrea remained in the village, enamored with the warm treatment she received from the locals. The community was friendly and close-knit, with neighbors always willing to lend each other a hand. Andrea was happy to reciprocate, welcoming visitors to her own home and offering help whenever it was needed. Occasionally, the village locals would come together to celebrate special occasions. While there was a local club, it was relatively inactive. Andrea was reminded of her time at the orphanage, where they would organize plays, concerts, and dances. She approached the club's head and requested to be appointed as the artistic director, but only in the evenings since she didn't want to leave her job at the post office. The director agreed to her request, but only on weekends. Andrea then gathered the women in the village and proposed forming a choir to sing songs. On her first Saturday as the new director, she organized a dance. The event was well attended by both the young and the old, with music and dancing adding to the fun-filled atmosphere. As Andrea walked home with her neighbor, she was praised for bringing some excitement to the village. Andrea replied that there was no reason to stay at home and that they should have some fun. From then on, every weekend there were small concerts in the club, where the local choir would perform. Andrea even recruited a group of elementary school kids to put on dances with her. She enjoyed working with the children and loved everything about it. "Hello, Andrea. Mrs. Austen greeted her as she arrived. The girl seemed surprised to see her, clearly in the midst of heading somewhere. "You always seem so energetic, capable of doing anything," Mrs. Austen commented. "There's a young boy in the village who has a passion for playing the accordion. He's self-taught and manages to play a bit, but unfortunately he doesn't have an instrument." "I see," Andrea replied, still unsure of where this was going. "Well, my grandfather left behind an accordion that the boy has been using, but it's very old and many of the keys are stuck. It's impossible to play," Mrs. Austen explained with a sigh. Andrea invited Britton Gibson to play at the club that evening, and she was impressed by his undeniable talent. Despite lacking formal education, she was determined to help him achieve his musical potential by setting a goal to procure an accordion for him. She headed to the local village council to write a petition requesting funds to purchase an instrument for Britton. The chairman agreed to provide financial assistance, but only for a used accordion. Undeterred, Andrea embarked on a search for the perfect instrument. She decided to travel to the city and explore the music school, hopeful that she could find a suitable accordion to purchase. "Good afternoon," Andrea greeted the principal as she walked into his office. He looked up and acknowledged her presence. Andrea proceeded to explain the situation, but the principal merely smirked. "Indeed, we do have some old instruments that have been discarded, but I doubt they would be an improvement from the one your young friend currently possesses," he stated. Feeling discouraged, Andrea asked, "Is there anyone else I could speak to about this?" The principal directed her to room 7, where Mr. Horn would be able to assist her. Andrea thanked him and made her way to the designated room, gently knocking on the door before entering. A young man was seated by the window when Andrea entered the room. The director had referred her to him, indicating that he could assist with her search for an accordion. He smiled warmly at her, and she soon learned that his name was Walter Horn. He had recently graduated from an institute and had been teaching at the school for only a year and a half. His passion for music was apparent, and he was eager to support his students. Andrea commented, "The boy's grandfather must have been a virtuoso on the accordion and taught him all the tricks." "I would love to meet him," Walter replied. Andrea understood what he was implying and asked, "How can we arrange that?" "I could find an excellent musician," Walter suggested. Andrea considered Walter's suggestion and replied, "I can bring Britton Gibson here myself if you'd like." Walter smiled and responded, "I think it would be better if I observe him on the spot. You know, native walls can be helpful." "All right, we'll be expecting you. You can come anytime," Andrea said, ready to leave. But Walter stopped her and asked, "Wait, what is your relation to this guy?" "I work in a local club as a dance director, and I have my own women's choir. I only recently learned about this boy and thought that if he had his own accordion, I could include him in our performances," Andrea explained, sharing almost everything with him. After a couple of weeks, Mr. Horn arrived in the village. Andrea offered him a place to stay at her house for a few days since he had no accommodation. They went together to the club, where Britton was also invited. Mr. Horn brought 2 accordions, one large and one medium. He handed the medium-sized one to Britton and took the larger one in his hands. "Are you ready?" he asked the boy. "I'm ready," Britton replied. As soon as he began playing, and Mr. Horn joined in, the music flowed beautifully. The boy smiled widely as he pressed the buttons on his accordion. It was clear that compared to Mr. Horn's instrument, Britton's accordion was just a piece of junk. "I want to take this boy to school," Mr. Horn said, turning to Andrea. "How will you do that? He's still young, and he won't be able to travel to the town," Andrea replied, confused. "In that case, I will come here on weekends to teach him. He's a very capable boy, and with a little musical education, he could become a virtuoso," Walter said with enthusiasm. He saw potential in Britton and was determined to help him improve. Andrea was happy that she could be of help to someone in need. Andrea was thanked by Mr. and Mrs. Gibson, who showed up at her gate in the evening with some treats. When she opened the gate, they expressed their gratitude to her. "Thank you so much," they said, looking at her. "No need to thank me, I just wanted to help develop the boy's talent," the girl replied, feeling a bit embarrassed. As promised, Mr. Horn arrived in the village every weekend to teach Britain. He stayed at Andrea's house, just as he had done before. One day, while at a rehearsal with Britain at the club, Andrea heard a knock on the window. Looking outside, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Austen, and invited her in. "How have you been?" Mrs. Austen asked with a smirk. "Oh, things are going really well. Walter has promised to enter Britain in a contest, and they're going together. I just hope the boy won't bring shame to our village," Andrea said cheerfully. "That's not what I meant," Mrs. Austen said with a smile. "What do you mean?" Andrea asked, suspicious. "How are things going with Mr. Horn?" the neighbor asked conspiratorially. "Oh, come on. What business do I have with him? We're just friends, nothing more," Andrea said, rolling her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Austen. I don't think Mr. Horn sees me in that way. I mean, I like him, but he's a professional and I'm just a small-town girl," Andrea replied, feeling a little embarrassed. "Nonsense, my dear. You're a talented and beautiful young woman who's done so much for our village. He should be lucky to have you by his side," Mrs. Austen laughed. "I don't know about that, but thanks for your kind words," Andrea smiled. "Listen, we're having a party in the village tonight. Why don't you bring Mr. Horn with you? Let him see how you can work and have fun at the same time," Mrs. Austen suggested, getting up from her seat. "I'll think about it. Thanks for stopping by," Andrea said, showing her out. Mr. Horn came back to Andrea's house, as usual, praising Britain's progress and discussing their upcoming music competition. Andrea then mentioned that there was a village party that evening. Surprised, Mr. Horn asked, "What kind of party?" "Just a gathering of women, showing off their skills," Andrea explained. "Well, I do love a good party. If you don't mind, I'll stay one more night," Mr. Horn said with a smile. Andrea replied, "No, I don't mind at all," as she fixed the tablecloth on the table. As the evening progressed, the whole village came alive with the sound of singing from the women's choir, lively dances by the youth, and Britain's skillful playing of the accordion. The tunes he played were new and different from what the village had heard before. As night fell, Walter and Andrea walked together towards her house. "Have you ever thought about moving to the city, Andrea?" he asked her. The girl blushed and replied, "No, not really. I like it here. I have my job that I love, my team relies on me, and I feel like I belong here." "Andrea, what do you think about me moving in with you?" He suddenly stopped, and Andrea's cheeks flushed. She turned to him, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't even proposed anything, and now he wanted to move into her house. "Mr. Horn, what are you talking about?" She didn't understand. "Andrea, I really liked you from the moment I first saw you. I admire how resourceful and driven you are, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since," he said as he hugged her tightly, pulling her closer to him. As they approached the house, Andrea noticed Mrs. Austen observing them from the window, causing her to feel self-conscious once more. After that, Walter visited their village a few more times to teach and train Britain. They even participated in a competition, but unfortunately, they only managed to secure third place. After that, Walter vanished. When Mrs. Austen asked about her boyfriend, Andrea felt furious. She had initially thought that he was a decent and intelligent man, but after finding out that she was pregnant, he disappeared without a trace. Andrea even set aside her pride and tried to contact him through the college, only to discover that he had quit and left. Andrea sat by the window of her house, feeling overwhelmed and unsure of what to do next. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the man who had left her after finding out she was pregnant. She felt hurt and betrayed, and the tears streamed down her cheeks. Mrs. Austen, her neighbor, came to her and tried to comfort her. "Don't get upset, girl," she said. "Everyone in the village loves you. We will help you bring up your child." Andrea wiped her tears and looked at her neighbor. "I will bring him up myself," she said, determined. "It's just a shame that there are such people. Look how he was." Mrs. Austen put her hand on Andrea's shoulder. "Everything will be all right," she assured her. "You are a strong and capable woman. You can do this." Andrea was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to go to the hospital. Andrea heeded advice and made her way to town. As expected, 3 days later, she began to experience contractions and gave birth to her much-anticipated son, Christopher. She named him after her father, who had passed away years ago. Andrea was overjoyed to have her own child and promised to give him the best life she could. Upon her return to the village, Andrea was not alone, but with her newborn child. Those who cared for and admired her came together to offer assistance. People brought diapers, a crib, a mattress, a stroller, and many other items to help her out. Mrs. Austen and the other women in the village helped take care of the baby while Andrea recovered. They brought food, helped with chores, and even held the baby so Andrea could rest. These people had earned the girl's deep gratitude. In the evening, Mrs. Austen approached her and asked, "Can you manage it on your own?" Andrea responded, "I'll do my best, but I'm not sure," as she attempted to give the baby a bath. Mrs. Austen stood by her side, offering advice and assistance, guiding her through the process. "You can always rely on me," Mrs. Austen assured Andrea. "If you ever need someone to babysit, I'm here for you." Since Mrs. Austen had no children of her own, she likely viewed Andrea as a daughter. Christopher was maturing rapidly, participating in his mother's dance group and preparing to attend kindergarten followed by school. One day, while in middle school, he asked his mother, "Why don't you ever buy me clothes? I always have to wear whatever people give you." "Christopher, you see, sometimes we may not have enough money to buy new clothes," his mother tried to explain to him, hoping he would understand the situation. In the past, when she lived independently and worked at the post office, her salary was modest, but it sufficed. She had everything she needed and did not desire more. However, when she became a mother, her child's daily requests for various things strained her finances. Money became scarce, and Christopher became increasingly frustrated with his mother because he lacked possessions that other kids had. "The boy is just going through puberty. Don't pay too much attention to his behavior," their neighbor advised Andrea. But Andrea was distraught and expressed her desire to provide her son with more than she currently could. She sobbed, wondering what to do. Mrs. Austen comforted her and suggested a solution. "Stop crying, let's think. Tomorrow, we'll go to the district center with you to buy some chickens. You can raise them, collect the eggs, and sell them at the market for some extra income." Andrea was still confused, but where will I get the money to buy the chickens? Her neighbor kindly offered to lend her the money, assuring Andrea that she would be able to pay it back quickly. After purchasing 50 chickens, Andrea's life took a turn for the better. She began waking up early to feed the birds and then headed to the market to sell the eggs before rushing off to work. As profits started rolling in, she expanded her farm by acquiring cows and continued to increase her earnings. By selling half of the eggs and setting aside the other half for incubation, the farm continued to grow. Christopher's life improved too, as he was able to attend school with new shoes and a new backpack, and even received his own soccer ball. However, his desires began to escalate, and he soon wanted a scooter or a bicycle. Although Andrea now had more money, she couldn't afford everything her son wanted, and she had to decline his requests. "I'll complete school and move to the city," the boy announced to his mother. "Okay, you can find a job there, finish your studies, and everything will work out." Andrea tried to console him by gently stroking his head, but he refused to let go. However, after that conversation, Andrea spent many nights crying and wondering why God had chosen such a difficult path for her. Wearing a brand new suit bought by his mother, Christopher stood at his graduation ceremony, radiating with happiness. However, his joy was not due to his achievement, but rather the anticipation of leaving his rural hometown for the city the following day. Christopher was eager to start working and earn his own money. He didn't want to live in the dormitory, so he asked his mother to rent an apartment for him. She obliged and fulfilled his request. From then on, the requests kept coming. Christopher demanded new jeans, a new record player, and more. He seemed unaware of the struggles his mother had faced while living in the village, and kept asking for more and more. In the spring, with just 1 month left until the end of school, Christopher spotted her on the street. She was standing on the bridge, looking lovely as ever. He longed to approach her, but he didn't know how. The girl sensed his gaze and turned to face him. She smiled and waved, and Christopher waved back. She came over to him. "Why are you staring at me like that?" she asked. "Because you're beautiful," the boy replied honestly. He saw that she wasn't at all embarrassed, probably having heard it before. "Thank you," she said simply. "Would you like to take a walk?" Christopher took a chance and hoped he wouldn't get hit for suggesting it. "Sure," she agreed. He wanted to jump for joy, but kept his composure. As they crossed the bridge, Christopher struggled to come up with a topic of conversation. He thought about himself, his interests in music, and his studies, but couldn't find the right words to talk to the pretty girl. Finally, he asked if she was from around there. "Yes, I am," she replied curiously. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to find something to talk about," he admitted, feeling embarrassed. "Well, we could talk about the weather," she suggested. "Okay, let's talk about the weather," Christopher agreed, realizing he didn't have anything else to say. Despite his struggle to find the right words, he found himself captivated by her, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. "Would you like to go to the park and sit down?" she proposed. "Sure," Christopher replied. "It would be nice to get to know each other a bit more." "I'm Laureen Wade," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "Christopher Evans," he said, shaking her hand. They took a seat on a bench. Christopher felt nervous and fidgety, unable to believe that he was sitting next to such a beautiful girl. "Which school do you attend?" she inquired. "I go to a technical college," Christopher replied, feeling ashamed that he wasn't studying at a higher institution. "And where are you from?" the girl asked. "I'm from out of town," he fibbed. "Do you live in a dormitory?" Laureen asked, her curiosity piqued. "No, I rent an apartment," he replied, trying to impress her. "Do you pay for it yourself, or do your parents pay for it?" she asked, surprised. "I pay for it myself. I not only study, but also work part-time," he lied without thinking. "Oh, I see. So you can buy me gifts," she said with a hint of greed. "Gifts? What kind of gifts?" The boy was confused. "I'll meet you here tomorrow at the same time," she exclaimed, abruptly getting up from the bench and hurrying away. Christopher was lost in thought as he sat down at home that evening. He kept wondering what impression he had made on Laureen. They met a few more times, and he decided to buy a ring for her. One weekend, he went to his mother's house in the village and asked her for money to buy the ring for the girl he loved. "Do you have a girlfriend?" Andrea asked him. "Yes," he replied calmly. The mother gave in and took out the money from the box, knowing she had to give it all for her son. She sighed and handed the money to him. Without even saying thank you, Christopher jumped up from his chair and ran out of the house. On their next date, Christopher gave Laureen a ring, which made her very happy. She didn't even ask where he got it, and he lied to her, saying he had earned the money by working. As their relationship progressed, Laureen introduced Christopher to her parents. Once again, he lied, saying that he had already graduated from high school, had a job, and was planning to buy an apartment soon. Laureen's mother even made a comment about how once Christopher bought the apartment, he could propose to her daughter. Christopher hurried back to the village, hoping to get the money from his mother for the apartment. However, his mother couldn't give him that much money, and Christopher felt angry and resentful towards her for not being able to help. He left home in a fit of rage, slamming the door behind him. He arrived back in town and told his fiancée that he wasn't able to buy the apartment yet due to financial difficulties. Christopher knew he had to start working to save up for their future. He managed to find a job at a local factory, which didn't pay much, but it was enough to cover their rent. Lorene moved in with him, and they started living together as a common-law couple. Lorene had once asked Christopher when he planned to introduce her to his parents. "Never," he replied. Lorene looked at him, sensing that he wasn't in the right mood, so she didn't press the matter. Andrea, her neighbor, came to Mrs. Austen in tears. "What have I done?" she asked. "I don't know. If I hadn't been involved in raising the boy, maybe I could have said something. But Christopher had everything. How could he do this?" Mrs. Austen sympathized with her friend. It had been almost a year since the man had asked his mother for money for an apartment, but he hadn't come or called since then. As a result, the couple was struggling to make ends meet in the city. "Do you even plan on proposing to me?" Lorene asked him. "Of course, but I need to make some money first," the man assured her. Lorene trusted him and patiently waited for him to fulfill his promise. Eventually, he resorted to a criminal deal to earn enough money for a new ring. Fortunately, Christopher managed to get away with it, but he didn't want to take any more risks. He lacked the courage to engage in such activities again. On that evening, he knelt down and offered her a beautiful ring, asking, "Darling, will you be my wife?" With tears in her eyes, she replied, "I should have called my parents." "We can go to them right now," he suggested, and the couple started to get ready. When they arrived, Christopher greeted his future in-laws. However, Lorene's mother was a strict woman and asked, why wasn't there any warning? Lorene showed her mother the ring and announced, "Christopher asked me to marry him." Her mother smirked and replied, "We never planned to get an apartment this way." The table was abuzz with discussions about the wedding venue and arrangements for the newlyweds. "Why aren't any of your relatives here?" the girl's father inquired. "Because I don't have any," the boy lied again. "I don't understand." The father furrowed his brow. "I'm an orphan," Christopher continued with his falsehoods. "Why didn't you tell us earlier?" His future wife turned to him. Suddenly, Lorene's father recalled, "Don't orphans usually get provided with housing?" "That's right, but there seems to be some issue with the paperwork." He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. Christopher and Lorene managed to hold out until the end of the evening before heading home. The following day, Christopher informed Lorene that he was being sent on a business trip. However, he actually took a day off from work at his own expense and decided to visit his mother to ask for money to finance their wedding. He knew he could admit to his mother that he had nothing and hoped that she would forgive him for being away for so long. He planned to appeal to her emotions and use it to his advantage. He entered the house where he had spent his entire childhood and called out, "Anybody home?" Christopher, his mother, ran out to greet him, hugging and kissing him. He pulled away from her embrace, wrinkling his nose, and said, "Don't do that." "Why did it take you so long to come?" she asked, leading him into the room. "Mom, I need money for my upcoming wedding," he stated simply. "Of course, how much?" she asked, already heading to her sideboard. "As much as you can give," he replied without hesitation. Andrea retrieved a wad of cash from the box and handed it to her son. "I have to go," he stood up. "What, you're not even staying the night?" Andrea was surprised. "I can't." He pulled on his sweater and walked towards the exit, leaving his mother in tears. Just after Christopher left, Mrs. Austen came in and asked, "What, you came to get the money again, and that was it?" "Yeah," Andrea exhaled. "Why do you spoil him so much?" Mrs. Austen couldn't understand her neighbor. She would have put him in his place long ago. "I can't help it, he's my son," Andrea replied, rubbing her handkerchief in her hands. Christopher returned to town feeling satisfied and put the money on the table. "What is it?" The bride was surprised. "Money for the wedding. A bonus paid at work," he said. "Now we have enough for everything, the dress and the restaurant." Lorene was happy and Christopher was relieved. The newlyweds had a wonderful wedding with the presence of Lorene's parents and other guests. Throughout the night, Christopher was nervous, worrying that his mother might appear and ruin everything, but she didn't show up, so he relaxed. The couple received many gifts, which made Lorene very happy. She counted the money and suggested they go on a trip. "Sure, where do you want to go?" Christopher asked, willing to go anywhere with her. "Let's go on a week-long vacation," she replied. So they went on a trip, and although it was only a week, they had a great time. Christopher was finding it hard to motivate himself to do anything, much to Lorene's concern. "Have you thought about asking for a bonus at work?" she suggested one day. While Lorene was working hard and even receiving support from her parents, Christopher seemed stuck in a rut. If they wanted to afford anything beyond their means, Lorene would turn to her father for help. Their marriage continued for 10 years, but Christopher became increasingly bored. He remained in the same low-paying job, and the family struggled to make ends meet. Despite their long years together, they never had children. "Hello, Christopher," a young trainee girl approached him one day. "Yes, what can I do for you?" he replied, with his usual dissatisfaction. "I'm new here. Can you show me around the plant?" She seemed to be flirting with him. "Angel?" Christopher read her name badge that was hanging from her pocket. "Yes," she nodded with a smile. "All right, let's go." Christopher was willing to do anything except work. Mrs. Austen paid a visit to Andrea's house, calling out to her as she stepped inside. "Andrea, are you home?" she asked. "Yes, come in," Andrea replied warmly. Mrs. Austen, who had been retired for some time, had a bad back, and Andrea had been giving her regular injections to ease the pain. "Why don't you stop working and take a well-deserved rest?" Mrs. Austen suggested to her friend. Andrea had already made up her mind to sell her house and belongings to buy an apartment for Christopher. However, her friend, Mrs. Austen, advised her to think about herself for once and stop worrying about her son. "I want to sell the house and the whole household," Andrea said to Mrs. Austen. "Why are you doing this? Where are you going?" Christopher asked in confusion. Andrea explained that Christopher had been asking for an apartment, and she would sell everything to buy it for him. She planned to buy a small house for herself with the money left over. Mrs. Austen couldn't believe it and shook her head. "How could the earth carry such fools?" she exclaimed. Andrea was still concerned about how to earn Christopher's forgiveness, but Mrs. Austen urged her to put herself first and stop worrying about her son's approval. Andrea pondered on her decision all night, but ultimately, she decided to sell her house and most of her belongings, keeping only a few chickens. The next day, she asked her friend Mrs. Austen for help in finding a cheap hut in the growing village. Mrs. Austen suggested they visit Dustin Hudson, a city businessman who rarely used his summer cottage, and who might be willing to sell it to Andrea. They went to his house and knocked on the door. To their surprise, Dustin was actually there, working from home. He greeted them and listened to their request, and after a bit of bargaining, they came to an agreement on the price. Andrea was thrilled to have found a new home, even if it was just a small hut. She thanked Mrs. Austen for her help and immediately started packing up her things to move. She knew it wouldn't be easy to start over at her age, but she was determined to make the best of it. Andrea's house didn't stay on the market for long either. A week later, 2 luxury cars arrived, and some men walked around the yard, inspecting the property. They talked among themselves in hushed tones. "Thank you, it's perfect for us," one of them said, handing Andrea an envelope. "Thank you for your promptness," Andrea said, clutching the money to her chest. She moved into her new home and sent the money to her son, explaining that it was for the purchase of an apartment. When Christopher received the large sum of money, he was initially confused. But when he read the message, he smiled. It seemed like his mother was trying to make amends. As he walked away from Lorene, he made it clear to himself that he had no intention of leaving her. "Finally, we can purchase our own apartment," he said, placing the bills on the table. Lorene hadn't addressed him as darling in a while. They had selected a house, bought it, and now it was time to decorate the interior. Lorene's mother was assisting them. "I never thought he'd keep his promise," Lorene's mother remarked. "And you accused him of being a liar," Lorene replied, contemplating divorce as of late. Her husband frequently failed to return home, and he often drank while ignoring her. However, after recent events, her thoughts on the matter shifted. Life began anew for Christopher and Lorene in their new apartment. Christopher even took time off from work to spend more time with his wife, and they began their honeymoon again. They felt rejuvenated and youthful. "I've been such a fool," Lorene said, lying in her husband's embrace. "We're both good," he replied, kissing her. The next 5 years were blissful. However, Lorene suddenly felt ill and realized she might be pregnant. She immediately went to the drugstore and bought a pregnancy test. "What baby?" Christopher wondered when she told him. "Darling, I've been wanting this baby so badly," she begged, but her husband couldn't comprehend having a child at their age. "We'll be taking our child to first grade when we retire," he shouted at her. The wife remained silent, sitting and crying. Christopher didn't return home that night, nor did he show up the next day. He was gone for a week. So did sending him money help? Mrs. Austen inquired of her friend. "It had to," Andrea replied. She was now living alone in a small, one-room house. "What do you think we should do?" the former roommate asked. "I think we should go to him. Maybe something has happened," Andrea suggested. "Do you think he'll be happy to see you?" the companion questioned. "I don't know, but we need to try," Andrea shrugged. After getting ready, Andrea was seen off by Mrs. Austen. She hadn't been in the city for a while, and much had changed. Her son had sent her the address of their new home after they had bought the apartment. Andrea would occasionally send him money. As it grew late outside, she went to the door and rang the bell. Footsteps approached. "Who is it?" Christopher's voice asked. "It's me, your mother." "I'm here to visit you," she replied cheerfully. He swiftly opened the door and stepped onto the patio. "What are you doing here?" he hissed at the woman. "I came to see how you're doing. You live so far away, you should at least come visit," the woman explained. "Here, buy yourself a return ticket and go back to your village," he said, putting money in her hand. "I don't need your money. I have enough of my own." She tried to give the bill back. "That's it. Goodbye. Don't write, don't call, and most importantly, don't come back," he barked, then retreated back into the apartment and closed the door. "Who was that?" Lorene asked. Lorene and her husband had never agreed on having a baby. She had decided that if Christopher objected, she would file for divorce and stay with her parents for the time being. "No one," her husband replied curtly when she asked about the visitor. Suspicious, Lorene looked out the window and saw a thin woman leaving the house. She quickly threw on her coat and followed her. The woman got into a cab, and Lorene got into another one to tail her. "Excuse me, you don't know me, but you just visited us." Lorene caught up with the woman at the train station. "Are you Lorene?" the woman asked. "Yes," Lorene replied, surprised. "I'm Andrea, Christopher's mother," the woman said calmly, tears streaming down her face. "How's your mother?" Lorene asked, breaking the silence. Sitting on a bench, Andrea recounted her son's recent actions to Lorene. Although he had never mentioned her to anyone, he had come to her asking for a ring, then a wedding, and now for an apartment. Lorene was shocked. "I can't believe I lived with that scoundrel for so many years." "Come on now, he was doing well for you," Andrea comforted her daughter-in-law with a hug. However, Lorene had new troubles. "I'm pregnant, but he's forcing me to have an abortion." "It's almost like an ultimatum," divorce or abortion? Andrea remained impartial. What do you want to do? I want to give birth, Lorene replied tearfully. Then do it. You have money. You have everything you need. Andrea reassured her, passing a roll of bills to Lorene. Thank you for your support. Lorene stood up and hugged her mother-in-law. Come with me. After getting into the taxi, Lorene directed the driver to her parents' address. As they arrived, Lorene introduced her mother-in-law. Here's Christopher's mother. Her parents were stunned and her father blurted out, Isn't he an orphan? Andrea was taken aback. What do you mean? How is he an orphan? Lorene revealed the truth. He's been deceiving us all his life. Despite the shocking revelation, Andrea was grateful for her daughter-in-law's honesty and accepted the offer to spend the night with them since there were no more buses available. The women sat in the kitchen and talked for a long time. After Andrea left, Lorene chose not to inform her husband about the conversation. The very next day, she filed for divorce and division of their property. As a pregnant woman, she was entitled to most of the apartment. Christopher was left with two options, either give Lorene the apartment and receive compensation for his share, or sell the apartment and give the money to his wife. He likely chose to sell the apartment, thinking it would be the better option. Lorene gave birth after the divorce was finalized, and she never saw her husband again. However, her daughter had two loving grandmothers. One lived in town, and they visited the other during vacations.